This is Whitney Will from Star Hearth Astrology, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Aquarius rising, and I'm going to be talking about, yes, what it means to have Aquarius on the rising sign, but also taking a look at the rest of the whole sign chart and what that can say about the essential life path of an Aquarius rising, having each of the signs in specific houses. If you're interested in more of the basic introduction to this series of videos, you can go and check out the intro video that I made about them. Otherwise, let's jump in. Okay, so when we're talking about Aquarius rising, right, that means we have the sign of Aquarius in the first house on the ascendant of the chart. And so the thing about being an Aquarius rising is that Aquarius contains the archetype of the exile, the archetype of the outsider, of the one who is more of an observer than a participant. And so being in the first house is a place of self-concept. And so we might identify that way. We may feel like we never quite belong to the group, like we don't know how to play the rules of the game. Eventually, because this is a sign ruled by Saturn, that becomes easier. And that sense of being on the outside becomes a source of strength as we get older and Saturn's virtues develop. In the beginning, it can be quite confusing and I think a little bit lonely. Now, Aquarius rising natives have Saturn as the ruler of their chart because Saturn is the traditional ruler of the sign of Aquarius. And so these are children of Saturn. And I think what we see, the Saturn of Aquarius is different from the Saturn of Capricorn because the Saturn of Aquarius, the inflexibility comes from within. And I was struck one time by Austin Kopic's description of this because he said that it takes a lot of strength to be like the weird kid, and that Aquarius has this sense of, right, of never quite belonging, and that develops into this kind of there's a kind of fortitude in that. Right, the ability to kind of hold your own against the sense of what maybe the mainstream wants you to be. Now, I don't think with Aquarius it's necessarily a choice. In some ways, it feels like an indelible feature that hopefully Aquarius risings come to appreciate about themselves. Now, the first house has to do with the self-concept and how we see ourselves and how we present ourselves to the world. And I think really as a psychological place, there is a lot of, okay, what do I bring? And I think what Aquarius risings bring is a perspective that is out of the norm, sometimes even compulsively out of the norm. And so, right, their core identity or the way that they position themselves is not being a participant in everything, but having the strength of an observer that kind of stands outside. Now, I think that can make them come off as standoffish or cold, and I think even proud. But what Aquarius has at the core of it is an idealism, is a sense of striving for the greater good or some kind of social standard that goes beyond the role of the individual. In some way, it can be self-sacrificing like Virgo, but doesn't take itself so personally. The self-sacrifice comes from the depersonalization, the Saturnian existential understanding that, hey, maybe my experience of this is not the most important thing. So that's Aquarius rising. Now, that tends to be what we hear people talk about when they're talking about the rising sign. What I'm going to do in these series of videos is talk about how each Aquarius rising has each of the signs in the different houses. And so we can understand what it means to be an Aquarius rising by being the sign that has Libra in the ninth. And instead of having, having the Aquarius rising piece be the most important piece, see how it exists within the context of a family of all of the zodiacal signs laid out in different ways. So with that, I'm going to start moving on to Pisces in the second. So each Aquarius rising will have Pisces in the second. And so, how this house is going to go, how it's going to function is going to depend on where Jupiter is in the chart, how well dignified, what the aspects are like, how complicated it is. And that's, that same principle is going to hold true for how the rising bit goes is going to depend on Saturn. So while the second house depends on unique features of Jupiter within the chart, there's some things that we can say. What do we get when we impose the archetype of Pisces onto the topics of the second house? Well, we do not get people that hold on to money and wealth and possessions with a kind of tight grip. Pisces is a place of easy come, easy go, of trusting the process. Now, obviously, this can go well or go poorly, right? Having Jupiter, the planet of abundance, rule over the house of your possessions can make you too generous to the point at which you're not very good at moderating your spending or your generosity towards others. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're destined to be penniless. It means that money is not the most important thing, right? Pisces is going to see beyond that to the kind of spiritual quality. Now, I think conversely, it could also mean that you fall under the kind of almost like religious trance of money. But money becomes something that is in some ways more emotional and immaterial. So, having a water sign in the money house means that we're not quite concretizing these things. There's an ebb and a flow. Now, the second house is not just money, it's resources. And I think with Pisces in the second, we also see that some of the greatest resources of an Aquarius rising have to do with their intuition and their spirituality and their connection to the divine, right? Aquarius risings can seem cold and cut off. And I think that Pisces can too, but what Pisces has found is kind of at the edge of losing themselves, a connection with God. I think the despair of Aquarius, which Aquarius might not experience as despair, but I think it yields into Pisces, the dissolution into oneness. And so, that is a tricky way to deal with money. Now, every Aquarius rising will have Aries in the third. And here I see kind of some of the attributes of Aquarius risings having brashness, or even, again, what Austin Coppock called the Aquarian dismissal, this kind of dismissiveness around topics. I've already thought about that. This is not worth discussing. And this kind of cold and curt quality in their communication. Well, the third house is the place of communication. It's the place of the familiar. And Aries is the most impatient sign. And so there's this kind of quick fire. This is also, I think we're going to see this kind of tone is underscored in having Cancer in the 6th house, because here we have these two houses that have a lot to do with daily life and daily maintenance. And we've got the kind of inspired fits and starts of Aries in the one house, and then we have the moon, this kind of emotional center that's always changing in the 6th house. So there's this kind of cardinal quality to those things. It's not a consistent way of being. There's not a kind of, like, the daily life is more punctuated and staccato. This can also be a kind of impatience when learning new things. If you don't get it immediately, it's not worth even doing. It can be an impatience in explaining yourself, right? So not understanding how to do the kind of legwork to bring people along with your ideas. And that being also another way that Aquarius risings might seem aloof. Now, the 3rd house is also the house of family members and of siblings. And with Mars ruling the 3rd house, we can have maybe a lack of closeness or almost an impatience that Aquarius risings have towards their siblings. Now, this can also just happen literally in the sense of having martial siblings. So, for example, I am an Aquarius rising. One of my siblings has a Scorpio stellium. The other one is a Scorpio rising with a lot of Aries. So, right, having these martial siblings. Okay, moving on to the 4th house. And I think we'll see with the angular houses just how definitional they become. So the thing about being an Aquarius rising is that all Aquarius risings will have Taurus in the 4th. And Taurus in the 4th, I see as this great tree sinking its roots down into the ground, right? Seeing home as the most stable and foundational place. So, right, while Aquarius risings may be out in the world, kind of performing their God-given role of telling other people how they're wrong, right? Embodying some kind of cynicism, sometimes some kind of critique of the social order, yet their home is their place of grounding, the place that they want to be the most stable, right? Nature will connect them with this sense of groundedness. And right, they need a clean and strong foundation to hold them. And right, also that interaction with nature, interaction with food, these kind of Taurus pieces to be a private and nourishing piece for them. Now, the 5th house for Aquarius risings is Gemini. And the 5th house has a lot to do with playfulness, with children, with pleasure. And we see with the sign of Gemini there that there's an intellectual bent to all of those things. And so there can be a sense of doing a lot of things in life, the sense maybe that life is a bit of a game. And right, when we're talking about the self-expressive nature of the 5th house, that can be Aquarius risings being willing to just try on new ideas without ever really having to commit to them, which is a very Aquarius rising thing too. It doesn't ever want to fully accept the weight of any label, belong to any club, belong to any category. And I think that the Gemini rising in the 5th house really underscores this. This, I think, is a really good signature for people who enjoy board games. Now, of course, it's going to depend on where Mercury is, what Mercury is doing in the chart, but this is a mercurial space. And so there's part of the playfulness of the 5th house is the duality and the transformative kind of trickster quality of Gemini. Then we have the 6th house. And the Actually, one more thing I want to say about the fifth house. Gemini is one of the most creative signs. I think probably in terms of, visual creativity, design creativity, we have Gemini, Leo, and Libra really as some of the most potent and generative. And so I think, there was one time when I was talking to somebody about Aquarius risings and they said, oh, they're all artists. And I think that's why, I think this is where I see that, right? In Gemini in the fifth, and they're willing to be playful. Now, I think that having Mercury in the fifth can also, there's so many hobbies, there's so many different things that they're trying to do. And so I think we see a lot of that. And now the sixth house is ruled by Cancer, ruled by the moon. And so right where the moon is going to affect how this goes. But the sixth house is a place of embodiment, a place of where we come back down into our finitude, where we realize that we are not all potent and that we are not all powerful. And the sixth house related to the moon really shows kind of that Aquarius rising natives can be blindsided by the needs of their own bodies. Right? Part of being an Aquarius rising can sometimes feel like being just like a floating head, and that it's the connection with the body and with the moon itself that sometimes brings you back down. And sometimes not in fun ways, right? The sixth house is not necessarily a fun house. It's a place of chores, a place of duties. And with it being ruled by the moon, that might be hard for Aquarius risings to be consistent about. So it can be really hard for them to keep a routine or keep up with a diet or or take care of themselves in a really consistent way. I think there's a kind of intellectualization where they can go off in their minds and kind of forget about their bodies. And so I think that is an indelible feature of Aquarius risings. Then we have the seventh house with Aquarius risings. And so here we're starting to get these houses that reflect. So the seventh house is the opposite of the first house. Leo is the opposite sign of Aquarius rising. With the seventh house, we have the projection, right? So if the first house is stuff that we associate with ourselves, then we're going to project things into the seventh house. That's not me, that's you. I can't own that about myself, so I'm going to put that on other people. The seventh house can also be what others bring out in us. It can be what we offer others that we have trouble offering ourselves. It's a place of partnership. And so Aquarius risings, while they might want to be free and they regard themselves with sometimes this cold cynicism, often there's a very acute critique of themselves. Their warmth towards others and their celebration of others tends to be quite high with Leo in the seventh. They're apt to see the kind of epicness of others, sometimes not seeing that in themselves. They also want partners and relationships that are like prizes, that are epic, like Leo. And I also think that, right, wherever Leo falls in our charts, right, that is the home of the sun. That is a natural place that we want to center. And so I think for a lot of Aquarius risings, regardless of the placements that they have in the seventh house, partnerships become one of the most grounding, orienting, kind of centering parts of their lives. Because in a first house sense, they're kind of coming and going, right? I think there's a sense with Aquarius risings that they're not always present. And I see that pretty much across the board, right? Sometimes they're not responding to text messages. Sometimes you're talking to them and they don't appear to be there. Sometimes they are very, very present, but it oscillates a little bit more. But relationships end up being this kind of leonine fixed fire, like the warming center of things, where they can experience warmth and they can bring warmth to others. And also they really need that. Now, Aquarius risings have Virgo in the 8th. And Virgo in the 8th, I picture as an old alchemist lab buried in the basement of the 8th, where different materials are transformed into others. And in the 8th, we're talking about materials made from what I call the interpersonal shadow. So the shadow of ourselves in relationships, the deep darkness of our psychological truths, of our shame. I think that having Virgo in the 8th creates a pretty potent shame vortex. Because the 8th house is a place of shame, and because Virgo is the sign most susceptible to shame. Right? There's also the patience in that space, the patience of Virgo to do the long work, to have the patience to heal ourselves and others. Now, I think to speak more to it on the shadow side, I think the critique of Virgo in the 8th house turns itself not only on the native, but also on their partners. And that Virgo in the 8th can become this kind of spiritual taskmaster, both for yourself and for other people, deciding what work they need to do in order to evolve in the way that you think they should, right? And that kind of pride and that kind of almost pompousness is sometimes associated with Aquarius risings, because there is this kind of sense of like, what would they do? And indeed, the astrologer Sam Reynolds talks about the connection of Virgo and Aquarius and calls Aquarius winter Virgo. We can kind of see, because Virgo is another sign that is deeply dedicated to an ideal, and but more in the sense of really in the individual and not an ideal of the society. So I think we see that. Right? The potency and the significance of this house is going to depend on what's in the house and the role that Mercury plays in the life of the native. Okay. Libra in the 9th. So Libra is a sign that is about getting everything to the correct proportion. It's not just about the balance of you and me in relationships. It is about the balance of everything in the world, right? Saturn is exalted in Libra because Saturn creates the boundaries and sets the proportions. And in Libra, right, beauty comes from everything being the right size, right? Everything having a place and filling that place. And when we put that in the 9th house, the place of belief, the place of creed, the place of divining principles, the place of long-term planning, the place of travel, what we get in Aquarius risings is a desire for to create like perfect philosophical harmony that is ultimately beautiful in their understanding of the world, right? We see the core desire at the heart of Aquarius, that the world should be understandable, that it is possible for the world to be mapped out as it should be, for it to be perfectly balanced, for it to make sense, and for everyone to be able to live in peace as Libra would desire. Now, we come to the 4th angular house of Scorpio rising, that is in the 10th. And again, I think, right, we start seeing something about Scorpio in the 10th indelibly defines what it means to be an Aquarius rising, because every Aquarius rising will have Scorpio in the 10th in a whole sign house system. And before I talked a little bit about Aquarius risings, desire to not fully commit to anything. And I think you see that desire to not be seen, that desire to not fully fully appear in the Scorpio 10th house, which I think works both ways. In that, what I mean by that is Scorpio in the 10th either is kind of antithetical to 10th house matters. So, right, the 10th house is really where we're on stage in the world, and Scorpio does not want to be on stage necessarily. What Scorpio wants to do is to put the shadows of the world on stage, right? What Scorpio and Aquarius are really, really good at is seeing what other people are intentionally ignoring, right? Aquarius is committed to the truth, and Scorpio is committed to understanding the way that secrets create power and to calling people out when they're intentionally ignoring things. And so both of these signs are deeply committed to the truth, but that truth transcends individuality. And so can see that manifest in Aquarius in this kind of depersonalization. In Scorpio, that they have a stomach for pain, right? They understand that truth hurts, and yet there's something deep in the core of that there's pleasure in the truth, even when it hurts. And so having Scorpio in the 10th house for an Aquarius rising, you might see them perform their pain in certain moments and then completely disappear, right? So it's, if you go back and look through, there are these kind of bracingly honest posts on social media about stuff that other people might try to hide or might try to deny. And Aquarius rising can say, if I'm feeling this, then other people must be feeling this too. And Scorpio is going to say, what you need to do in the world is tell the truth, even if it breaks things down. And if that's you, that it's breaking down, so be it. There's a psychological bent to that. So you find a lot of Aquarius risings being involved in some kind of psychology. And I mean that in really loose terms, whether it be literally mental health or it be as writers looking at the psychology of characters or looking at the different ways that we understand the world. There's this kind of wanting to get inside of things to figure them out. And again, if we have the water signs in the career houses 2, 6, and 10, then we see this kind of caretaking quality there too. And I think that's another way that Cancer in the 6th can end up being a caretaker, being in service and mothering to those things. Sagittarius in the 11th used to make me laugh because the 11th house is the place of friends and allies and hopes and connections. Again, I feel like the 11th house is Jupiterian, whether or not, like, it's just Jupiterian in its descriptions. And so to have Jupiter ruling the 11th house, we see that definitely for sure with Aquarius risings, right? The people that they're connecting with are people that they share ideas with, that they share a pursuit of the truth. Sagittarius also deeply cares about the truth, but Sagittarius is going to care a lot more about meaning making than Aquarius is. Aquarius almost goes the other direction. How much of this existential truth can I swallow? And how does that transform me? Whereas Sagittarius it's a fire sign. It's about the intoxication of passion, especially with regards to ideas. And so Aquarius risings find themselves at home in groups that are usually intellectual, that are kind of idea or belief based. That's where they're going to find their connection. That's where they're going to find their tribe. And I think the 11th house is also a big place of the source of inspiration for us. Now it's also the place of our audience, of how other people receive us. And so the same thing, I think, is going to, like, we can just flip that on its head, right? Aquarius risings are going to be received well in groups that that they can kind of identify with intellectually, in groups of questions and answers around belief systems. And so I think there's a lot of kind of motivation and joy in that. Now, we come to the 12th house, the place of self-undoing, the place of self-sabotage, the place of losing their minds, the place of the loss of the ego, the connection with God, and in some traditions, bed pleasures. I think what we find in the 12th house is, all right, the 12th house blindsides the first house, right? The 12th house so maybe I'll start there. The 12th house and the first house for Aquarius risings are so intimate, right? This is the only sign, this is the only rising sign where the first house and the 12th house are ruled by the same planet, right? Where Saturn is the ruler of the 12th and the first house. No other rising signs are going to have this. All of them are going to have separate rulers of those houses. And so what we find with Aquarius rising is that it is their minds that pose the deepest danger, I think. It is their melancholy that poses the deepest danger, right? Speaking of Saturn, it is their melancholy that pulls them into the depths where they have to wrestle with the Capricornian piece that says you are outside of the walls, right? Capricorn is on the inside of the walls, maintaining tradition and history, and Aquarius is the exile. So Aquarius, by definition, exists outside of Capricorn, and yet those houses are tied together. There's that wrestling. If you're familiar with the book of Genesis in the Bible, there is a story of Jacob wrestling an angel all night. And right, I take the story metaphorically to speak about how we wrestle with doubt, or we wrestle with the demons in our minds all night, and how, right, over a course of a lifetime, that wrestling both wounds us, which happens to Jacob, and he walks with a limp for the rest of his life, and also blesses us. So as he is wounded, so Jacob demands to be blessed. And it wasn't until I was 26 and I learned the role that Saturn played in my chart, that I could identify this within myself and suddenly turn my kind of lifelong wrestling with melancholy and demand that the Saturn of my 12th house bless the Saturn of my first house. I think the 12th house, right, in maybe a less intense way, maybe this is more intense, also, right, is our habits that kind of drown us or eat us alive that we can't really see. We never keep fully in our sight. And I think for Aquarius risings with Capricorn in the 12th house, if you've got a lot of planets in there, that's the tendency to overwork, to think that you're only worthy if you're working really hard. And there's this kind of, the 12th house can kind of be a vortex that swallows us, right? You can never work enough to create that belief. And I think the other thing that can happen is that we think that Aquarius risings can think that unless you've completely mastered the 12th house, all of your demons, all of your psychological traumas, all of your darkness, all of your shadow, unless you've completely mastered that you're not allowed to just be a person in the light of day doing normal things in a first house way, right? So I think they're tied together, and it might be different for people depending on where your Saturn is, depending on how it's configured. But right, this is a very unique feature, how the first house and the 12th house are tied together, even though, right, in the story of the chart, the 12th house is the most invisible place. It's the place that we're reacting to as the first house. And I think that reaction in this story is Capricorn saying, this is the way that things have been done, so this is the way that they need to be done, right? The weight of history, the weight of the institutions, the weight of the establishment. And Aquarius's response to that being taking a good long look at that and saying, that doesn't work. This is BS. I am gonna buck the system and stand outside of it. And this isn't just because it has been that way, doesn't mean that it's going to continue to be that way. And that doesn't mean that it's right. In fact, it probably means that it's wrong, right? So there's that kind of inflexibility of Saturn becomes almost a creed with Aquarius risings. It's less of this haunting shadow of the heaviness of Saturn in Capricorn, and more of this, I think Uranian, how we would characterize as Uranian inner rebellion that resists the yoke of Capricorn. So that's what I have to say about the archetypal life path of Aquarius. I would love to hear how that resonates for Aquarius risings, or if you know Aquarius risings, if that was interesting. I'll be back during Pisces season to go over the archetypal life path of Pisces. Thank you very much.